In the Amish church, closeness between girls is encouraged for modesty and safety, but no one talks much about how that closeness can quietly become the strongest physical bond in our young lives. I grew up Old Order Amish in Pennsylvania. My name is Eliza, and for most of my life, I didn't have language for what my body learned long before my mind caught up. I'm not talking about romance or anything secretive. I'm talking about touch that was allowed, expected, and invisible because it was framed as innocent. Shoulder to shoulder, hands folded together in a buggy, sleeping head to toe in shared beds during visits, the kinds of physical closeness that never raised concern because they fit inside the rules. When I was a girl, physical space wasn't something we owned individually. We lived close. We worked close. We moved through the world in groups, especially as girls. That closeness was practical. It kept us safe. It kept us watched. It kept us modest. But it also shaped us in ways we rarely named. Outsiders often imagine Amish girlhood as emotionally restrained, even cold. That wasn't my experience. It was physically warm. There was a lot of contact, just not the kind people assume. We held hands walking to school. We leaned into each other during long sermons. We braided each other's hair, our knees touching on wooden benches. At night, when visiting cousins or friends, we slept in shared beds because there weren't enough rooms, and no one thought twice about it. These were not moments of rebellion. They were part of the rhythm. The rule was clear. Physical affection between unmarried girls was safe because it didn't lead anywhere. Marriage was between a man and a woman, full stop. Anything outside that framework wasn't considered a destination, so it wasn't treated as a threat. That belief created a strange space where deep physical comfort could exist without explanation. I remember one winter evening when I was about 12. We were at a neighbor's house after a singing. The adults were still talking in the front room, and the girls had been sent upstairs to wait. There were 6 of us in one small bedroom. We sat on the floor, backs against the bed, our wool stockings brushing. One girl rested her head on my shoulder. Another took my hand without asking. It felt steady and grounding, like we were holding each other in place. No one spoke. No one needed to. At the time, I didn't question it. It felt as ordinary as breathing. Another memory comes from school. In winter, the classroom stove made the air uneven, hot near the front and cold by the windows. During lessons, my closest friend and I would press our legs together under the desk for warmth. Sometimes she would slide her foot over mine, just to feel another body there. The teacher never noticed, or maybe she did and didn't see a problem. It wasn't against the ordnung. It wasn't flirtation. It was comfort. What people misunderstand is that these bonds weren't secret because they weren't forbidden. They were hidden only because no one thought they mattered enough to name. Emotional closeness between girls was expected. Physical closeness was simply an extension of that. The community reinforced it quietly. Girls were taught to be gentle, helpful, tuned in to others. We learned early how to read small shifts in posture, how to offer closeness without words, a hand on a back when someone cried, an arm linked while walking home. These gestures were part of how we cared for each other in a world where emotional language was limited. But there was also a boundary we could feel, even if it wasn't spoken. Touch was acceptable as long as it remained unexamined, as long as it didn't raise questions, as long as it stayed within the category of girl closeness, which had no adult future attached to it. As I got older, that boundary became more complicated. During my teenage years, the same physical habits continued, but my awareness changed. I started noticing how much I relied on that closeness, how calming it felt to fall asleep with another girl's shoulder against mine during visits, how empty my body felt when I lay alone at home afterward. No one warned us that these bonds would have an ending. Courtship shifted everything. Once a girl began seeing a boy seriously, her physical availability to other girls quietly reduced. She sat closer to him during gatherings. She spent less time piled together with us on benches or quilts. There was no announcement, just a gradual redirection. Touch that once flowed freely was now meant to be reserved. I remember feeling the loss before I understood it. One of my closest friends started sitting apart, hands folded in her lap. When I leaned toward her out of habit, she stiffened slightly, then smiled as if to smooth it over. That small movement told me something had changed, even though no one explained what. The community didn't talk about this transition because it was considered natural. Girls grow up, they marry, they move their closeness where it belongs. But no one asked how our bodies adjusted, or if they did at all. There was a kind of grief in that silence. For me, the physical bonds between girls were my first experience of being held without expectation. There was no role to perform, no future to secure, just presence. When that disappeared, marriage was supposed to replace it, but marriage came with structure, duty, and different rules around touch. It was not the same kind of comfort. I want to be careful here. Many women find deep peace and fulfillment in Amish marriage. I know some who feel held and supported in ways that work for them. My experience is only mine. Still, I think it matters to acknowledge that the transition from girlhood closeness to adult restraint can be abrupt, and not everybody makes that shift easily. The emotional impact shows up quietly. Some women become restless without knowing why. Others feel an unnamed longing during moments of loneliness. We're taught to pray through discomfort, to serve through it, but we aren't taught to recognize what we've lost. After I left the community, it took time to understand why I missed certain kinds of touch so intensely. I wasn't longing for romance. I was missing the uncomplicated physical presence of other women, the way we once leaned into each other without explanation. One part of this that deserves deeper attention is how shared sleeping shaped us. As girls, we often slept together well into our teens during visits, weddings, and long church weekends. Beds were shared out of necessity, but the practice carried meaning. Falling asleep beside someone else's breathing teaches your body that closeness equals safety. It trains your nervous system to settle in company. I remember lying awake during a long visit at my aunt's house, the room filled with the quiet sounds of sleep. The girl beside me shifted, her arm draping across my waist without fully waking. I remember the weight of it, steady and warm. That physical reassurance stayed with me long after the visit ended. When I later slept alone in my own bed, the absence felt louder than any noise. We never talked about these moments. They were not memories we revisited out loud, but they lived in our bodies. When marriage ended the practice of shared sleeping, the loss was framed as maturity. You're grown now. You don't need that anymore. But need doesn't always disappear just because it's inconvenient. For some women, this shows up as difficulty sleeping alone. For others, it becomes a quiet craving for closeness that doesn't fit neatly into marriage roles. Naming this doesn't mean criticizing the culture. It simply means acknowledging that bodies remember what once brought them comfort. Looking back, I don't see those physical bonds between Amish girls as something dangerous or shameful. I see them as a response to a communal life that valued togetherness and safety. They gave us grounding during years when our worlds were small and closely watched. What feels important now is honesty. Not to sensationalize, not to accuse, but to recognize that these early bonds shape how we experience closeness later on. When we understand that, we can meet ourselves with more patience. If any of this echoes something in your own experience, you're not alone in it. Sometimes simply naming what was once silent is enough to let it rest more gently inside us.